President Joe Biden is laying out his steps to stem the ongoing surge in violent crime in the United States, specifically crime related to gun violence. As we've talked about on the show on multiple occasions, there has been an uptick in the number of homicides in the United States, and we've debunked the myths about what led to that spike in homicides. Republicans will have you believe that defunding the police has led to this, but the fact of the matter is most cities and municipalities have not in fact defunded the police, and the very few that had city councils vote in favor of redirecting some of the police budget have not actually implemented it quite yet. But nonetheless, what we're seeing across the country, whether we're talking about cities and states that are governed by Republicans or Democrats, we're seeing this spike in violent crime, and it does need to be addressed. Now, the question is, will the left tackle this on and provide an alternative to the tough on crime legislation that, Joe Biden had championed in the 1990s, or are we just going to allow this pendulum to swing back to a tough on crime narrative? And we'll see. But what I'm seeing from Joe Biden so far is a bit of a mixed bag. So let me give you the details. As the Associated Press reports, White House aides believe that Biden, with his long legislative record on crime as a former senator, is not easy to paint as soft on the issue. And the president has been clear that he is opposed to the defund the police movement. Now, all of that is true. And what we're seeing with the GOP and how they're essentially setting things up for the midterm elections is they're focusing mostly on the surge in crime and blaming the Democratic Party for it. Now, one can argue that it would be difficult to blame Biden for the surge in crime, considering the fact that one of the biggest criticisms toward Biden was the fact that he championed the crime bill, and the crime bill was draconian. It led to mass incarceration. It was, of course, a tough on crime piece of legislation that led to quite a bit of criticism toward Biden by progressives. So the question is he going back to those policies? Will Republicans succeed in painting him as someone who's weak on crime when he clearly has a record that's the antithesis of that? We'll see. But here's what we know so far. Biden is not in favor of cutting police budgets. In fact, he is advocating for the use of a significant portion of the coronavirus relief bill to be utilized by municipalities to bolster policing efforts locally. So set aside $350 billion from the American Rescue Plan in state and local funding to advance community policing strategies, such as investing in new technologies and bolstering prosecutions of gun traffickers. So since a lot of the focus is on homicides, a lot of the focus is on gun violence, you're gonna see a common thread with these executive orders pertaining to guns. Now, is he going far enough? No. There is also a serious issue. This is a serious issue that requires attention. So I don't want to take away from that. But at the same time, I am a little worried about some of the directions he's going in. For instance, he wants to launch a collaborative of 15 different jurisdictions that will invest their federal funds into community violence intervention programs. That sounds pretty good. He wants to, this is good, expand summer programs, employment opportunities and other services for young people so they are productively engaged and less likely to commit crime. So it looks like there's more of a focus, on crime prevention as opposed to just using deterrence like tough on crime measures and incarceration, mandatory minimums, those kinds of things to kind of deter violence, which doesn't tend to work. Actually investing in these communities might work. But what I do worry about is the fact that he wants to set aside the $350 billion from the relief package in order to help provide additional funding for police. That could be part of a solution, but it depends on how that money is being spent. There's a lot of vague language about how the money could be used on community policing, but then you read about investing in new technologies. What does that mean exactly? What are the new technologies that local police departments will invest in order to prevent or deter crime? Does it mean additional surveillance? Is this going to be another way of redistributing taxpayer money to various Silicon Valley companies that make all sorts of surveillance technology for police departments? These are questions that need to be answered. And I want to be clear, what he's proposing here, not even proposing, what he's doing here is through executive orders. This is not something that's being proposed and would need to pass through Congress. Now, again, violent crime has become increasingly problematic in this country. Crime had gone down significantly after the 1990s. Now we're seeing the uptick. We saw an explosion in violent crime in 2020 during the pandemic. In fact, here's a quick video explaining just how bad it's gotten.
80% spike in Minneapolis homicides this year is part of a nationwide surge in murders during the pandemic.
We're seeing something historic here.
Jeff Asher is a crime analyst in New Orleans who has studied 2020 data for more than 50 cities.
And in those cities, murder is up about 36% this year relative to last year, which, to put that in some perspective, the largest national year-to-year change we've ever had is a 12.5% increase.
While most crime, including home burglaries and robberies, has gone down, murder rates have risen sharply, both in large cities like New York, Chicago, and Seattle, and in smaller ones like Lubbock, Texas, and Greensboro, North Carolina.
So we're seeing these increases, and I do think it's important for the Democratic Party to respond to it, but not to respond to it in a way that's framed by the Republican Party, because as we know, they are not as negative toward some of the tough on crime policies that end up imprisoning nonviolent offenders and keep them locked away for years at a time. Now, with that said, though, I do want to focus on what I think could be a positive aspect of what Biden is doing here. I'm going to read this graphic again because it's important. Expand summer programs, employment opportunities, and other services for young people so they are productively engaged and less likely to commit crime. Look, these are the programs, the community-based programs that have worked in the past. There's actual data and evidence indicating that they've worked. In fact, when crime started to surge during the 2020 year as a result of the pandemic, a lot of these community organizations that provide resources to young people, that provide a place of gathering for young people, shut down. And that actually ended up being incredibly problematic. Watch.
The real issue for us is, what is the correct response?
Harris Calvin points to a number of community-based violence prevention programs, like Violence Interrupters, which send community members to immediately meet with shooting victims to try to avoid retaliation. But the pandemic and the need for social distancing put many of these programs on hold.
And I really feel like there hasn't been enough attention paid to that aspect of the pandemic and how it played a role in the increase in violence. In fact, it was briefly mentioned in a Daily Beast article that we had talked about a few weeks ago, where Rachel Cohen wrote, "The pandemic weakened community institutions that experts say typically help deter crime." Patrick Sharkey, a sociologist and criminologist at Princeton, has said the corresponding disconnection from places like schools and pools and rec centers all help increase the conditions that may lead to violent behavior. Roman at the University of Chicago too has argued that the disruption of routine activities for large numbers of young men in poor areas likely contributed to violence with other young men in similar situations. And look, we can look at recent case studies in regard to what happened after these resources were shut down during the pandemic. We can certainly look at data regarding how community programs have helped to deter crime or prevent crime. We could also look back to an incredibly intelligent member of Congress during the 1994 crime bill, someone who had the courage to stand up in front of other Congress members, in front of the American people, and make the case that isn't being made today. Watch.
A society which neglects, which oppresses, and which disdains a very significant part of its population, which leaves them hungry, impoverished, unemployed, uneducated, and utterly without hope, will, through cause and effect, create a population which is bitter, which is angry, which is violent, and a society which is crime-ridden. And that is the case in America, and it is the case in other countries throughout the world. Mr. Chairman, how do we talk about the very serious crime problem in America without mentioning that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world by far, with 22% of our children in poverty and 5 million kids hungry today? Do you think maybe that might have some relationship to crime?
So what Bernie Sanders was addressing there was the root causes of crime. And that's what I hope Biden's emphasis will be on. Because the $350 billion in relief spending now being redirected toward beefing up policing and helping to buy more surveillance technology, and all of that is a Band-Aid. I would argue that it could even be counterproductive, as we've experienced in the past. But if you focus on the root causes of crime, if you actually provide a situation in which young people see a future for themselves, where they see opportunity that they can actually take advantage of, I think that that would be far more effective in deterring crime and preventing crime. And so again, there are some positive components to what is being noted by Biden. We don't have full details yet. We need to hear him elaborate on exactly how he wants this to, be carried out. But here's some more good news. He wants to help formerly incarcerated people successfully re-enter their communities and transition to employment, which will include housing assistance and the appointment of a formerly incarcerated person to a DOJ role focused on reentry issues. That's fantastic. So to what extent is that going to be implemented? We don't know yet, but the fact that Biden is focusing on that at all is a good sign. He also wants to launch 5 multi-jurisdictional firearms trafficking strike forces to stem the flow of guns between cities and states. So I'm very curious to see how that's going to play out, because right now, because of a lack of action by Congress on a federal level, you have cities and states essentially pass their own gun laws, which is really difficult to enforce when we're not talking about sovereign countries here. We're talking about cities and states as part of one major country, and it's just easy to cross state lines, city limits, whatever you want, with a gun. And so I'm curious to see if this works at all. But I will say, another major criticism I have toward Biden is just his unwillingness to really take bold action and use his bully pulpit to pressure Congress to do the right thing in regard to gun laws. Previously he suggested that there should be a commission to study gun violence. I think that's weak sauce and lame and should not be honestly uttered by the president. It's embarrassing. And even in this case, Biden renews his calls for Congress to pass gun legislation. And that's it. He'll renew his calls, and then we won't hear about it again until there's another mass shooting. He'll renew his calls then, and that's it. That's it. There needs to be more pressure. There needs to be more action by Biden, right? And just simply saying, I call on Congress to do their jobs. As we know through recent history, they're not going to just do their jobs because Biden is calling on them to do it. He needs to find ways to pressure them through carrots and sticks. It doesn't seem like he's willing to do that. But again, this is a mixed bag. There are some good signs here, and hopefully the majority of his emphasis will be on helping communities, emboldening communities to provide opportunities for people so they don't feel the need to engage in criminal means to make money. That's a huge part of this as well.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.